The movement away from the Tiananmen Square hoax has become a stampede. Wikipedia now admits that the so-called massacre never happened. Mainstream media this year almost entirely ignored the anniversary. A new study suggests much of the public knows it was a hoax, and claims that diplomats still believe in it are quickly falling apart. And we'll also be sharing two hilarious examples of BBC reporters being defensive about things they reported that now everybody knows are not true. First, take a look at this. The grey area shows what normally happens when you publish something on the internet. The amount of interest and engagement sparks briefly and then levels off. But see that steep upward line? This is the chart for a report we published last week with plenty of footnotes and sources that told the real story of the events in Beijing in 1989. And you can see that interest in it is continuing to rise steadily. For people who didn't see our report, here's a two-sentence recap. Original sources from the West show that three Western groups, the US, the UK and Australia, in June 1989 published a piece of fiction signed by former British Ambassador Alan Donald that 10,000 peacefully protesting students were killed with machine guns and crushed by tanks in Tiananmen Square, Beijing. Now that formed the basis of reporting on the topic for years. But journalists, diplomats and increasingly members of the public gradually realised it was pure fiction, created as a black op by Five Eyes agents from the US, Britain and Australia. Now here are the facts. First, Wikipedia. Although some mysterious anonymous Wikipedia editor will not allow the word massacre to be removed from the title, the text itself now describes the Alan Donald fiction, which has been debunked by all verified witnesses, including Alan Donald himself, as a disputed cable, and admits that in 2011, 3 secret cables from the United States Embassy in Beijing agreed there was no bloodshed inside Tiananmen Square. Second, most mainstream journalists now know that incident never happened. We can tell because they almost all now ignored the annual ritual of recycling the debunked story. Most of the reports this year came from known propaganda groups such as Radio Free Asia and China Digital Times and so on. One exception I saw this year was Reuters, which printed a story that echoes the long debunked Alan Donald document. Here it is. But let's not blame Reuters journalists Jesse Pang and Yumo Lee. I know from Reuters' other staff, speaking off the record, that secret politicised interference in reporters' work comes from the editing level at Reuters. Third, the public is starting to get it too. One example, a recent survey by a popular left-leaning US commentator, Matthew John of This American Left, saw 85% of respondents reporting that they knew the massacre didn't happen, with only 15% supporting the black op narrative of students being killed in the square with machine guns, etc. Now, obviously, that's a limited survey of people who follow him, but we can't use big surveys because there are none. The big media who normally commission surveys are not going to pay for a study which proves that they have spent decades telling the world about something that never happened. I mean, picture the headline. A new study shows that we've been lying to you for decades about China. I mean, everybody in the world is going to shout back, we know. So it's better for the media to take the coward's way out and fudge the facts or just drop the story. Helen Davidson of The Guardian decided to fudge the facts this year by saying that hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed in the streets around Tiananmen Square. In fact, most of the deaths happened 5 kilometres away. Sorry, Helen. Still, as Sherlock Holmes pointed out, sometimes the fact that a dog is not barking is actually the biggest clue of all. So the omission of the massacre story is now the real story. Like the fictitious Uyghur genocide, Matthew John said, the story of the blood-drenched Beijing Square has been quietly abandoned by the Western press and its bourgeois backers. Actually, his piece is so good, I want to read you a little more of it. The original cartoonish sensationalism has been replaced with a measured, meticulously crafted rewrite that includes the same themes and accusations: authoritarianism, opposition to democracy, the crushing of dissent, state repression and brutality, etc. Even after removing the central element, the fictional June the 4th massacre, the narrative itself miraculously remains intact. Yeah, well said, Matthew. But, I hear some people say, The Hong Kong Free Press said that diplomats were mourning the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, and the headline was very clear about that. Yes, well, there are about 200 countries and territories in the world, and when we read the small print, the Hong Kong Free Press is actually reporting that it's talking about 4 countries, the US, the UK, Australia and Canada, all 4 of which are members of the Five Eyes disinformation group, and 3 of which were active participants in that specific scam. So the headline could have been, more than 90% of foreign diplomatic missions didn't mourn the massacre in Tiananmen Square because they're not stupid. They know there was no massacre in the square. Now I want to show you something else. Interestingly, there was a huge spike in visits to the Wikipedia page this year, much more than previous years. Look at this. Now there's evidence that many of these visits come from people interested in educating themselves about whether it happened or not. Why do we think this? Well, if we look at global news discussion platforms, the biggest by far being X.com, we see that the vast majority of references to the topic this year are to posts discussing the fact that it was a hoax. Also, our recent report with detailed footnotes, links and sources was seen by more than 300,000 people on various platforms. So we may have contributed a bit to the rise of people researching the topic. But there are some funny aspects to this which are worth knowing about. First, while most people discussing the topic on X value the truth, an exception is the BBC's John Simpson, who hilariously argues that he saw the Tank Man incident happen on June the 4th before he left the city with his own eyes. Little problem here, it took place on June the 5th. That's when Simpson would already have been on the other side of the world. Now, if you point out this rather devastating fact to Mr. Simpson, however politely and gently, he blocks you. This tells us all we need to know about Mr. Simpson's core values. Second, the BBC's James Miles sat on the real story for years and finally admitted that there was no massacre on Tiananmen Square. But people tempted to praise him for this shouldn't miss the fact that Miles hilariously described the massacre story as one detail. Here's what he actually wrote. We got the story generally right, but on one detail, I and others conveyed the wrong impression. There was no massacre on Tiananmen Square. So here's where you say wall-to-wall coverage of the Tiananmen Square massacre for years was wrong in one detail. The detail being that there was no Tiananmen Square massacre. I mean, this is a bit like saying, for many years I reported that black is white, but I got one detail wrong. Black is not actually white. Now, many people have asked about our documents and sources. Here are 3 quick answers. 1, how do we know Carl Gershman was funding activities targeting Chinese students before all that happened? Because he said so himself. It's printed in the NED annual reports from 1984 to 1989. Here are the grant allocations, details of the office opening in Beijing, and their decision to organise discussion groups. 2, how do we know Colonel Robert Helvey was a PSYOPs expert specialising in protest movements? Because he said so himself. In 2004, Robert Helvey published his work as a manual on strategic non-violent conflict thinking about the fundamentals. It describes NED colour revolution strategies, tactics and subversion campaigns. And Chapter 8 specifically describes how to integrate PSYOPs into protest movements. And number 3, how do we know Gene Sharp is a coup d'etat expert and was in Tiananmen Square with the students? Because he made the coup d'etat claim himself and wrote an account of his meeting with student leader Li Lu. And we know he worked with Robert Helvey, who was a, shall we say, mature student at Sharp's Albert Einstein Institute, which had nothing to do with the scientist of that name, and specialised in generating ways to achieve regime change through escalation of street protests. Now, all of this information is a matter of public record, and these are their words, not ours. Don't take my word for it. Do your own internet searches and you can check it out for yourself. The sources and links are all provided. Now, the bigger question is this. Journalism is important. With the Western mainstream media having abandoned its job, who is going to do it? And the short answer is you and me. And we're on the job, right? Peace.